a slave when these other white children I see are free to grow up, free to have books, free to be educated, free to roam and travel? Why am I a slave?
He's felt what it's like, the brutality of enslavement, the exploitation. He has decided that he's going to fight.
Born a slave, Frederick Douglass escaped and became one of the most powerful voices for freedom in history. How did a man who started with nothing change everything? Let's dive into 10 facts about the incredible Frederick Douglass. We guarantee you only know 3 of these facts. Make sure you subscribe, like, and share. Now, let's test your knowledge on one of the most famous Americans. 10. He chose his own name and birthday. When Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery, he took control in many ways. But did you know he chose not only his last name, but picked his own birthday too? There weren't any perks to slavery. It was the most horrific example of human-on-human abuse. But for those lucky ones who were able to escape it, they were able to control their own narrative. Born into slavery in the year 1810, Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. His date of birth, unknown. Frederick never met his father. He also barely knew his mother, who worked on a different plantation. However, his few memories of her included her calling him Little Valentine. No wonder, as a free man, when someone asked when he was born, Frederick responded February 14th. Once a free man, he would marry his first wife, Anna Murray. Together, they chose the name Douglass from a character in the 1810 poem by Sir Walter Scott, The Lady of the Lake. But did you know Anna actually helped Frederick escape slavery? 9. Dressed as a sailor to escape slavery. Escaping the grips of your master during slavery was very rarely a feat that could be accomplished solo. So when Frederick Douglass was looking to escape, he found his partner in none other than his future wife, Anna Murray. Frederick was born into slavery on a plantation in Talbot County, Maryland. At one point, he was sent to work on a plantation in Baltimore, Maryland. It was here where he would meet Anna Murray. Anna was not enslaved and worked as a domestic worker and a skilled seamstress. After several failed attempts on his own, Anna helped Frederick devise a plan. Frederick would pose as a free black sailor. He would use a Freedmen's Protection Certificate obtained by Anna and dress in a sailor's uniform that was sewn by Anna. Once off the plantation, Douglass boarded a train in Baltimore, heading north through several slave and free states. Despite the risk of being caught, his disguise and confident demeanor allowed him to pass without suspicion. He traveled by train, steamboat, and eventually arrived in New York City, a free state. Once in New York, Anna and Frederick became Mrs. and Mr. Douglass on September 15, 1838. From there, they settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts. 8. Helped free hundreds. Proverbs 18:22 says, "He who finds a wife finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord." In Anna Murray, Frederick found a counterpart that helped maximize his works. Together, he and Anna helped free over 400 enslaved people. Once the Douglass family moved to Rochester, New York, with the help of Anna, they were able to transform their home into a stop along the Underground Railroad. Rochester was one of the last stops before Canada for those seeking freedom. The Douglass family provided those seeking refuge with linen, food, and a bed. It is believed more than 400 slaves passed through their home. Beyond the facts, there is no doubt that without Anna, we never get Frederick Douglass. Not only did she help him escape slavery, but she put her own life and money on the line to do so. To raise funds for his escape, Anna sold her personal belongings, including her feather mattress, and used her savings from work. During their 40-year marriage, Anna was a bedrock for the powerful abolitionist. While Frederick hit the anti-slavery circuit, Anna stayed home and cared for their 5 children, while also bringing in income as a seamstress, laundress, and shoemaker. Frederick would go on to outlive Anna. She died on August 4, 1882, from paralysis. I'm sure she was also influential in this next fact about the works of Frederick Douglass. 7. An advocate for women's rights. Frederick Douglass was a committed advocate for the rights of all people, including women's rights. He was a firm believer that the freedom and equal rights of women were paramount to a more just society. Mr. Douglass backed up his belief by being one of the few men to attend the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention and marked the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. Even though many were hesitant to support the right for women to vote, Mr. Douglass passionately stated, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color." He also used his public platform to speak out against the oppression of women. Mr. Douglass wrote an article stating the rights of women were just as important as black men. However, where he slightly differed from advocates like Sojourner Truth, he didn't think the movement to grant black men the right to vote should be tied to women's suffrage. So when the 15th Amendment was proposed to grant African American men the right to vote, he supported the bill even though it did not extend the right to women. Even though he advocated and argued for voting rights for all, he believed the ability for black men to vote was more of an urgent matter because of how they were being violently disenfranchised en masse. Beyond this philosophical difference, Mr. Douglass's willingness to advocate for women's rights was simply a reflection of his belief in human rights for all. 6. Vice President Frederick Douglass. Did you know Frederick Douglass was part of one of the most legendary presidential tickets in history? Not only was Frederick Douglass the first black person to be nominated for vice president, he was on the ticket next to the first woman to run for president, Victoria Woodhull. Their nomination was made by the Equal Rights Party in 1872. The Equal Rights Party was a progressive political group that advocated for women's suffrage, labor rights, and equal rights across all races. Admittedly, the nomination was largely symbolic. Douglass never actively campaigned or even showed up to the party's convention. In fact, there's no evidence he even accepted the nomination. His nomination, or Woodhull's, was never taken seriously by the mainstream media. However, it did showcase how popular Douglass was. This moment was significant in showing Douglass's widespread influence and the growing push for equal rights and representation during the Reconstruction era. 5. Worked with 6 presidents. Being nominated for vice president wouldn't be the only time Frederick Douglass was close to a president. As a matter of fact, he engaged with several. As a leading abolitionist, civil rights advocate, and statesman, Douglass used his influence to push presidents towards policies that advocated racial equality, the abolition of slavery, and the rights of African Americans during and after the Civil War. It started with President Abraham Lincoln. Many mistakenly believe Lincoln and Douglass were allies immediately, but that's not correct. Mr. Douglass thought President Lincoln wasn't doing enough to abolish slavery. He also didn't agree with the president's efforts to preserve the Union and enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. Their relationship evolved once President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which freed enslaved people in Confederate-held territories. This led to many meetings between the two at the White House. Unfortunately, President Lincoln was assassinated, and the progress of the formerly enslaved and the rights of black folk stalled under his predecessor, Andrew Johnson. In 1866, Frederick Douglass led a delegation of black leaders to the White House to meet with Johnson and advocate for black suffrage. President Andrew Johnson argued that giving black men the right to vote would alienate Southern whites and hinder national unity. Obviously, Mr. Douglass didn't visit the White House during his term. He did go on to have a better relationship with President Ulysses S. Grant. Douglass praised President Grant for his attempts to integrate African Americans into American political life and for pushing for the passage of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed African American men the right to vote. Mr. Douglass felt betrayed by President Rutherford B. Hayes. The election of President Hayes signaled the end of the Reconstruction era, and through the Compromise of 1877, his administration helped usher in the Jim Crow era. Frederick Douglass found hope in the presidency of James Garfield. President Garfield supported civil rights and racial equality. Sadly, President Garfield was assassinated shortly after claiming the Oval Office. President Grover Cleveland was more conservative on civil rights, but he did appoint Frederick Douglass the minister resident and consul to Haiti in 1889. He maintained that diplomatic post under President Benjamin Harrison. Throughout his life, Frederick Douglass maintained a critical but collaborative relationship with U.S. presidents. While he admired some and had disdain for a few, he never let his feelings overshadow his mission to fight for the rights of African Americans. 4. Self-educated. As a former slave, it's not hard to believe that Frederick Douglass taught himself how to read and write, but it doesn't make it any less amazing. It wasn't until the 1960s through civil rights and decisions like Brown versus the Board of Education that equal education was offered to black Americans. It was more than 100 years after Frederick Douglass was born. When he was a child, the slave master's wife tried to teach young Frederick how to read. However, the lessons quickly stopped because the master feared a slave that was literate would be difficult to manage. So it was up to Mr. Douglass to educate himself, and he did. He would read the words around him, including the names of ships coming in and out of the nearby harbor. He would pay poor white boys with bread to give him reading lessons. To learn how to write, he would copy the letters he was reading, replicating them as he read them. He would also replicate the signatures of those around him until he was able to write his own. These skills were great tools as he gained the desire to help others. Through his readings, he developed the passion to become an abolitionist and advocate for women's rights. He rolled it into one and would go on to become a prolific orator. He would become one of the most prolific speakers of his time, but there was one problem. 3. The greatest speaker you've never heard. That's right, there are no audio recordings of who many consider one of the greatest orators of modern times. Frederick Douglass took the stage all over America and Europe. His words were grounded in his personal experience as an enslaved person. He had a unique ability to captivate audiences using the horrors he faced and bringing the brutalities he witnessed to stages. He spoke with such passion and conviction, he was able to garner influence over hundreds at a time. Mr. Douglass's mastery of the English language and his wealth of knowledge allowed him to command every platform. A huge influence on his oratory techniques was the book The Columbian Orator. This book taught him a great deal about public speaking and the art of persuasion. Frederick Douglass gave many memorable speeches. One of them was the "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech given in 1852. Here, Douglass delivered a scathing critique of the hypocrisy of celebrating American freedom while millions of Black Americans remained enslaved. Not only did he use his words to fight the abolishment of slavery, but for women's rights. He gave rousing speeches at the Seneca Convention in 1848 and at the International Council of Women in 1888. Though his voice can never be heard again, his words were recorded, and his speeches laid the rhetorical groundwork for the civil rights advocates who came behind him. 2. The most photographed person. Did you know that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person of his time? By the time he died in 1895, his image had been captured 160 times. In comparison, President Abraham Lincoln was only photographed 140 times. Now, I know 160 doesn't seem like that much. Most people have 160 pictures of their cat or sunsets on their phone. But you have to remember, photography was a relatively new medium during the 19th century. Even though it was new, Mr. Douglass knew how to exploit it and understood the power of perception through images. He saw photography as a way to combat the racist stereotypes of his time. Newspapers and publications would present caricatures depicting Black people as buffoons, idiots unworthy of respect. That is why in all of his pictures, he purposely poses to portray dignity and seriousness, rarely smiling, and if so, the slightest smirk. As a self-taught historian, Frederick Douglass understood the importance of documenting himself. He wanted his story and the mission he was on to be documented in many ways, unable to be oppressed by oppressors in the future. Frederick Douglass was not only the most photographed person of his time, but he also used photography as a tool for social change. By consciously controlling how he was depicted, Douglass challenged the racist depictions of African Americans and projected an image of strength, intelligence, and dignity, ensuring that he and his message were remembered accurately for generations to come. 1. Strong mind, strong body. Frederick Douglass stayed in shape. As a matter of fact, he lifted weights well into his 70s. Mr. Douglass was built like a middle linebacker, standing 6 feet tall and weighing 230 pounds. His physique was molded by his time on the plantation. His body was hardened by the abuse and back-breaking work he survived. To stay healthy, Frederick Douglass would work out, alternating his training between his front yard and bedroom. Historians believe he also trained at self-defense against any attackers while on the road. The weights he used are still on display at his former home in Washington, D.C. Between lifting weights, having a penchant for selfies, and being a fighter for human rights, Frederick Douglass would have had one of the greatest Instagram profiles ever.